Okay, I think we should be just about ready to get started. So I'll just go through a few quick housekeeping points just whilst everyone continues to join. So welcome everyone to today's Off the Page event run by Kogan Page. My name's Natasha. I am a senior marketing executive at Kogan Page and I'll be hosting today's event for you. For those of you who don't know, Kogan Page is an independent publisher of business books and content, and we've created these events to help bring key topics to life. And today I'm delighted to be joined by John O'Brien and Chip Walker, and we'll be discussing how you can activate your brand's purpose through authentic marketing. Please note that today's event is recorded as well, so we will be sharing the recording with you afterwards, so you can refer back to it at any time. And if you would like to carry on the conversation either during or after today's event, we'd love to hear from you. You can connect with us on social media at KP Marketing, and don't forget to tag John and Chip as well using the handles on the screen, and you can also use the hashtag off the page. And if you'd like to learn more about any of the topics or points that we discussed today, you can save 25% on a copy of both Chip and John's new books, Activate Brand Purpose and Truth Be Told, using the code OTP25 at koganpage.com. And please do feel free to post any questions or comments that you have in the chat throughout today's event. So we'll be doing a Q&A with the audience in the second half, but we will be picking up your questions throughout for that. So feel free to post at any time. And if you do use the chat, please make sure you send the message to all panelists and attendees, just to make sure that everyone can see your questions. And as I mentioned before, your microphones should all automatically be on mute, but please do remember to keep them that way throughout today's event. And I think that's everything. So to anyone who has just joined, this is the Off the Page event looking at how to activate your brand's purpose through authentic marketing. And thank you so much for joining us today, John and Chip. So before we dive into the subject of brand purpose and authenticity, would you mind both just kind of giving a quick introduction about yourself and why you wrote your book? So John, did you want to go first with that?
Hey, lovely. Hi, thank you, Natasha, and it's great to be here. So I'm John O'Brien. I am the EMEA managing partner for a group of Omnicom agencies called the 100 Agency, but actually that's a bit of a misnomer. We're actually 9 of some of the biggest agencies that are public relations, marketing, advertising, brand and creative and digital. And we work collectively to offer our clients, who are clearly some of the biggest clients in the world, a purpose-focused set of solutions when they're looking for their requirements. My co-author with this book is David Galler, who runs a Omnicom Public Relations Group for Europe as well. And we were moved to write this book on the basis of looking at some of the issues that were facing both our clients and others, and also agencies, in terms of being effective in responding to the demands around purpose communications now. My history in this space goes back several decades, but I created one of the UK's first purpose agencies 10 years ago, and help craft some of the language, some of the big leaders in the UK particularly. So that's me, and over to you, Chip.
Thanks, John.
Great. Yeah, thank you, John. It's great to be here. Thanks, Natasha. Sorry about that. I got a little bit of a cold, so bear with me. Yeah, so I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Strawberry Frog, which is a movement marketing firm in New York City. We have clients around the world, but we're headquartered here in New York. I've worked with my business partner, Scott Goodson, doing movement marketing for a couple of decades. And Scott co-wrote the book with me, Activate Brand Purpose. In terms of why we wrote the book, what we noticed is over the past 2 or 3 years, we had clients coming to us over and over again with the same issue, which is that they're participating in this kind of purpose craze that's going on, particularly in the marketing world. They've developed a purpose, maybe more than once, and they don't really know what to do with it. It's just kind of sitting there, it's on a t-shirt, it's on a plaque on the wall, but they need to do something with it. It was for that reason we went out and sort of looked at the marketplace and saw that there were tons of books about developing a brand purpose, but there weren't very many about acting on your brand purpose. So we saw sort of a hole in the marketplace and decided that we would try to fill it. And our approach, movement marketing, is really about purpose in motion. So we had sort of a unique approach that we wanted to bring to the world, and that was the reason behind our book.
Brilliant, thank you both. That sets the scene very nicely. So yeah, thank you, that's great. And let's get stuck in. So my first question for you is, why is purpose so important today, and how has the need for truth shifted? So Chip, I feel like you kind of started to touch on that in your introduction anyway. So would you mind taking that on for me, please?
Yeah. So why purpose is important? I think for a few reasons. One is consumers and customers themselves are becoming sort of more activist and more sort of values driven. And they're looking for companies and brands to do business with that sort of share their views. I think particularly among younger people. So we're seeing this more than we did, say, in the 90s or earlier. Companies also have a big need to motivate and engage employees. So if you look at employee engagement numbers around the world, they're horribly low. Most people don't like getting up and going to work every day, particularly if they work for a large company. So there's a huge need to give people a reason that's meaningful to get up and go to work every day, and purpose can do that. And then I think the last one comes from CEOs and C-suite, in that there's often a big need for an organizing principle to get all of their stakeholders moving in the same direction around a common cause. So I think all of those kind of work together to make purpose, as I said, kind of the idea du jour these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially the fact that, you know, purpose isn't just about what you're doing as a company, but it's engaging your employees internally as well. I think that's a really, really key point. John, did you have anything to add on that? Why you think purpose is important and how there's a need for truth, or how that's shifting at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree with absolutely everything that Chip has said. My take is slightly different because I'm not a conventional marketing or advertising or brand guy. I'm a business strategist. So I spent 20 years with the FTSE 100s and more looking at leadership. So I see purpose as a leadership imperative, not just a marketing tool. So I absolutely agree with the audience aspects and what's been happening, which Chip talked to, because we've seen a shift in the environment. But actually, when I talk about purpose, I talk about how a business is led, the behaviors and the culture in the business, and then how that is amplified into the marketplace or towards employees. So that effectively what I say is that you can drive external value for the values that you hold internally. So this is where performance can change. If you can have a really truly authentic, truthful purpose, meeting a human need, matched by innovation on products, services, employee engagement, culture, leadership behaviors. And then if those become embodied in the brand and embodied in the product and the service going into the marketplace, that's where we see performance change. So I look at it that way, and that's why I brought in alongside me, you know, my colleague who comes from the PR tradition. That's where I see purpose being more than just the marketing arm. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think we're going to come back to the kind of leadership aspect, because I think that's a really crucial part as well. But the next question I wanted to look at, I think, is especially relevant sort of from events that have happened in the last year, especially. How do you think brands can harness social movements without being accused of purpose washing or jumping on the bandwagon? I think there have been a lot of big social movements that have happened, and I think maybe businesses might be a bit wary to get involved because they might feel like they're seen as purpose washing. So John, did you have any advice for that firstly?
Yeah, so this is really the crux of what our book was about, because our book was to help communication professionals not fall into the trap of inadvertently creating what could be a purpose wash. So the authenticity of delivering good communications based on truism within the business will be critical to what Chip has got in his book. What we're concerned about is actually ensuring that that truth lies there. So if you take what's happened in the last year, some of the examples are not necessarily COVID related, but things like Black Lives Matter, gender pay gap, climate change. These are pressures boiling up on brands, boiling up on businesses to react to. Business leaders wanting to be good citizens and representing their stakeholders will often want to go and support a particular cause. But the challenge is when they do so without realizing that their internal behavior doesn't match the expectation externally. So to give you one very short example, very quick example, Black Lives Matter, obviously appalling, situation a year ago. Many CEOs of big corporates in the US and elsewhere came out and they tweeted the black square, which everybody was familiar about. But then actually, of course, what was seen was that within their businesses, they had actually donated money towards members of Senate and Congress who had actively blocked equal rights legislation. And there was a big PR background there, because they're saying, well, it's no good coming out and tweeting about Black Lives Matter if your company is making political donations to people that block equity in opportunity for people of race. So these are the issues that we as communicators, in whatever specialism we're in, need to be able to help our clients get right. That's my view on that.
I think, yeah, that sums it up really well, John. That's really interesting. Chip, did you have anything to add to that as well, on the concept of kind of purpose washing? Do you think businesses should always get involved with social movements?
Not necessarily. I think that's a big mistake that people make is companies, when they're trying to be purposeful, the first thing they do is to jump on some sort of social activism. And I guess our view and kind of the entire concept of our book is that movements are a great way to activate purpose, but that brands themselves aren't movements and probably don't start movements. Brands can use movement thinking, though, to activate their purpose and get people behind it in the world. So the whole idea of our book is the principles behind successful social movements. Those are principles that companies can use, and if they use them correctly, not be accused of purpose washing. And it really has to do with figuring out a change that you want to see in the world that's important, one that's shared with important members of your audience, figuring out what's standing in the way of that change, what the enemy is that you're up against, and then figuring out the stand you're going to take to bring that change about. So that kind of thinking is behind successful movements like Black Lives Matter. So our view is that you're better off to use the principles as opposed to trying to co-opt someone else's movement.
That makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, John, go ahead.
No, just absolutely. I mean, I think this is the critical thing. I mean, I see purpose being driven into business by two ways of making coffee. Being an Englishman, I'm a tea drinker, but Chip's no doubt a coffee maker. You have you have a cafetiere where you get leadership pushing down, trying to drive purposeful thinking into a business. But you have a cafetiere, that's the cafetiere, but you have a percolator where movements and things like that. Because actually one thing we forget is that the people in a business are joining the social movements. The employees are part of social movements to change. And I'm sure that's in Chip's book, but this is where, that's where the strongest sense of purpose originates, in my view, when it's a percolation rather than trying to force things. And where it goes wrong is where it's forced and it's not authentic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And so would you say, based on that then, I suppose the idea of, I think some people maybe sometimes feel like joining or being part of those movements is the same as purpose, but obviously your actual business purpose can be very different.
Yeah, sorry, can I pop in?
Yeah, go for it.
It's really what Chip was saying just earlier. Mobilization of or alignment with societal campaigns are a component part of reflecting what could be a true purpose for the business. There's no doubt about that. And of course, as a good citizen, you may want to be aligned with something in what I would call a corporate philanthropic manner, because it's not actually aligned to the purpose of your business. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. In the UK, Ford Motor Company, a couple of years ago, decided to commit a lot of contribution and support around mental health. And some people wrongly describe that as a purpose, part of Ford's purpose. No, it's not part of their business purpose, but it was under the gambit of reflecting the values that they had as a company through a purposeful manner along something which in the United Kingdom was being seen as a huge change in the way in which we think about mental health. So it was perfectly appropriate. It's just not the business of Ford Motor Company. It's not the purpose of Ford Motor Company. And there's a lot of misunderstanding in this way. But I think we would all expect the best companies in the world to be aligned with appreciating what is shifting in society and getting aligned with those movements which are part of their own expectation. That's what I would suggest.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, definitely. And I think that, yeah, that's the key thing. I think the value behind a business and, the business's purpose is definitely, different to that kind of philanthropic activity, which leads into my next question, which is, so looking at the kind of why behind a business, what techniques would you say businesses or brands can use to help sort of find their why or their purpose and then make it actionable? So Chip, do you want to go ahead with that one? I think you mentioned about actioning a purpose earlier.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing is, there are a lot of folks out there that charge lots of money to work with companies to help them find their purpose. What's your why? Why do you exist? I guess what we found is that it's usually not that difficult to figure out. If you do kind of a deep dive into the brand's company's DNA, you talk with leadership and employees about where they want to head. Figuring out why you exist, in our view, usually isn't that difficult. The much more difficult part is framing it in a way that people know what to do with it, which is kind of why our focus is on activating purpose through a movement. And a movement is a way of reframing a purpose so that you kind of know what to do with it. And I'll give you an example. One of our clients was a bank called SunTrust. Their purpose that they had developed was called lighting the way to financial well-being, which sounds great. Everybody thought it was a good idea. I mean, who wouldn't be behind it? But again, what do you do? And this was right after the financial crisis, the Great Recession. And a lot of people, at least in the US, had not really recovered from the recession, even 2 or 3 years later. And we started to realize that culturally, a lot of people were in bad financial stress. They couldn't put, $500 together in case of an emergency. And that what everybody really wanted was to gain financial confidence. So we sort of reframed the purpose in terms of having an enemy of financial stress and a stand for helping everyone have the ability to be financially confident. All of a sudden, employees, bank tellers, everybody sort of said, okay, I know what I'm supposed to do when I get up and go to work every day. I'm going to help people be financially confident. I'm going to use tools. I'm going to use everything I know how to do behind that goal. It was a movement we created called On Up, Onwards and Upwards, and ended up with, I think, over 6 million people participating. And it was a huge win for the bank, not only for their business, as John has been referencing, because it did help them grow their business, but I think more importantly, it got employees very motivated and gave them a sense that what they were doing in the world mattered and was important. So that's just kind of an example of like, not just finding your why, but framing it in a way that you know what to do with it.
Yeah, I think that's great point, definitely, and the framing being the key thing there, I think, is something that really resonates for employees as well. To be able to know how to interpret that, I think, is a real crucial part of it. John, did you have something to add to that, or any other thoughts?
I mean, I'd just add an example, because I absolutely agree with Chip, although I've probably been one of those people that charge quite a bit of money to find a why, but no, I got to be honest with you. But no, I think, firstly, you're absolutely right. It should be in the DNA of business. Businesses, obviously, some will be still founder-led, and that's easier to find because they will have created it. Others may be historic, over 100 years old, but you can find it by looking at what they do, whatever. The basis that I've worked, and in fact, when I created my own agency, our tagline was activating purpose for good. So absolutely what Chip has talked about. And the critical thing here was I looked to the human need. Okay, now going back to what Chip said about the financial crisis, 2009, 2008, the 10 and the fallout meant that we saw the throwout of the Friedman philosophy that purpose of business was purely shareholder return. We know that's not the case, that's debunked. What came to its fore is that there should be a human need. So you're solving something for people rather than just selling something to people. So when you can activate a sort of brand purpose, it's not just the words, it's actually the way in which people feel about that brand, as Chip has said. And I'll give you another example of a great international business called Walgreens Boots Alliance, which I'm sure we're all aware of in our own brand territories. They're a client of mine in my own agency. Their global purpose is to help people lead a healthy and happy life. Now, if you're in the pharmacy world, that makes sense. Activating it would be that if you went into a Boots in the UK or a Walmart's in the US, instead of saying to a manager or a member behind the counter, what do you do? And instead of them turning around and saying, well, we're here to man the tills or sell this product or whatever, if they all turn around and said, well, actually, I'm here to make you feel healthier and happier. And if you knew, if you didn't feel very healthy and happy and you're walking around down the high street and you thought, where do I go? And it was health and happiness, that's where I go, to Boots or Walmart. You would have activated both the individual in the way Chip said, and also the way in which the brand is perceived in the street. So I think activation is critical. If it just becomes a set of words on a piece of paper, and if it's too long that people can't remember it, it's a waste of time. So absolutely aligned.
Yeah, has to be clear in all senses. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks, John, and a great example as well. So for the next question, I just want to pick up on, Chip, what you said about in terms of engaging employees. So how would you say you can ensure that the people who really matter to a business or a brand engage with that purpose? So internally being employees, and then obviously externally feeding out through to customers and clients. Chip, did you want to go for that one first, please?
Sure. So the question is, how do you make sure that your key stakeholders all are
engage with that purpose? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think part of it goes back to what I was just talking about, which is how you frame it. Have you framed your purpose in a way such that you have a common goal that both your customers, your internal stakeholders, your external stakeholders, that everyone has in common? So the example I just gave around helping make people financially confident, that was something that everyone involved in SunTrust, inside the company, outside the company, everyone could get behind that and thought it was important. So when you have that kind of framing, a common enemy, a common goal, when you frame it correctly, we find you can get everybody on board pretty easily, inside and outside. I think the trick, and what John was talking about, was that the top-down pressure versus the bottom-up boiling up. That we say you have to kind of activate it top-down, bottom-up, and middle-out. There's been a lot of research done that shows if you try to mandate it from the top, it won't work. If it's just people at the bottom, it won't work. You've actually got to do both of those and get middle management involved for it all to work.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely. John, did you have any advice on that in terms of making sure the people who really matter to your brand and business are engaging with your purpose?
I love Chip's statement there, but it means I need a third way of making coffee, which I don't know about. Making coffee from my own analogy. Well, what I'd say is absolutely agree. I mean, I think, so my approach here is that if you think about purpose being, the best advocates for purpose to live, in my view, are the people that are in the business, in turn, effectively creating the stories and creating the behaviors that manifest through the activities externally. So purpose rests not just in the marketing communications space, but it rests in service and production in terms of innovation of products and services. It rests in finance, it rests in HR, but most importantly in the leadership and the culture. And therefore that's where actually I think we as communicators should be looking for the credentials of the behaviors and activities that then manifest into the product. So our model is based on, of course, the conventional aspects of audience assessment and channels, but we say right at the start is a human truth. Are you trying to feed somebody, entertain them, move them, keep them healthy? What's the human truth? That should manifest itself into the purpose truth. So that is what Chip and I would be talking about. That's the statement that says this is why we exist. You then have basically the practice truth, which is how does the business operate? So for example, it's no good saying that your purpose is to help people be healthy if actually you have unhealthy work practices for your employees. The truth has got to be in the practice of the organization. That should then reflect into the products that you produce. So obviously, if you're in that world, you should have product. And then you get what we call the purpose effect, the truth effect coming out from all of that, because there's an alignment between how your employees behave, what they think of the business, the products that are produced, they meet a human need, and that's where you can build things out. So that's our approach. But I think the two, I very much like that analogy of I'm going to say it again to repeat it, top down, bottom up, and middle. What did you say there, Chip?
Middle out.
Middle out. Right, I've got it. I need to read your book, which has arrived today. So I get the detail.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, John, definitely. And so in terms of just picking up on what you said there, John, about making sure that it's actually reflected in your own working practices as well, those human truths and what you stand for, would you say that in terms of then communicating that externally and sort of in your marketing, would that be something that sort of naturally evolves and happens organically, or do you have any tips for kind of making sure that is communicated then in an authentic way as well? Oh, you're on mute there, John.
No, well, actually, of course, I've got to say that it only happens if it happens on purpose. Of course, you can have accidental positive communication in the same way that you can have accidental negative communication. But if you're going to do this right, you've got to on purpose think about what it is that's got to be done. And the reason I say that is that we all know, in our different specialisms, that we can become highly engrossed with the question. We can become highly detached from reality. So because we'll lock ourselves in creative workshops and we'll look at the collateral and we'll create the campaigns or whatever. And the risk I find, and I have found through examples that we've shared in the book, is that because you don't retain, you become so engrossed in what you're doing, the creative side, etc., it can sometimes really backfire because it lacks the touch points within the business and with the outer world. So one of the aspects of this is you've got to understand the behaviors in the business, what employees think, etc., etc. Not least because every employee now is a whistleblower. So if you're inauthentic with your communication and your campaigning in respect of how you treat people internally, that will be known. But the second thing is that if you don't truly understand what's happening in the world, how can you ever attempt to communicate purposefully to it? It's impossible, you'll get it wrong. And think a few years back to for example, the Kendall Jenner Pepsi advert, for example, which is infamous in terms of getting it wrong.
Yeah.
But I bet you the creatives in those rooms thought that was a highly creative, well-expressed embodiment of what the values of Pepsi going forward. It was a disaster. So I think, we've got to ensure that we're constant in our creative processes connected with both the internal audience and what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example to touch on. Actually, that's a great example of that. Chip, did you have anything to add, or has John sort of covered that off nicely, do you think?
That Pepsi one, it was just a sort of, what were they thinking? It was filmed like a block from my house, and I remember walking by and seeing it being filmed, and then later scratching my head. In terms of communication, I think that's another sort of fallacy out there, particularly in the marketing world, is that you developed a purpose. Now, what are you going to say? And our first thought is that it should be about, what are you going to do? What are you going to do to get people to participate, to get involved? What action are you going to take? And it could be inside your company, in terms of products, services, operation. It could be in terms of what you're doing among your employees. It could be in the community. It could be philanthropy. But we find that once you put a series of actions in place, what to say starts to become a really easy thing to solve for, which obviously something Pepsi did not do.
Yeah, and if I just tap off very quickly, I mean, the reality is, of course, if I go back to what I said earlier, which is that purpose is not just a marketing tool, it's a leadership imperative, and it's a cultural aspect of why. Then actually the critical thing is that the story to be told comes from within the business, not from outside. So primarily, for example, if you take Unilever, they made sustainable living commonplace as their purpose many years ago under Paul Polman. Well, that drove innovation in their soap products. That drove reduction of water usage. That drove things which were beneficial to sub-Saharan communities in a way that if they hadn't had that purpose, that innovation probably wouldn't have taken place. And that innovation then became the story. It became the defining brand proposition in the marketplace, in contrast to other soap companies. And I think that's the critical thing. Then there's a story to be told, and it's a truthful story. And then it's aligned with things like the green and the environment, et cetera, which is the movement aspect, which Chip obviously focuses so much on there. So I think that's the great alignment between this thinking, in my view.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. Thanks, John. And I think that's a great point to be moving into the Q&A now with the audience. So please feel free to post your questions in the chat if you haven't already done so, and we'll be picking those up now. So the first thing I want to start with is, so Jenny in the chat has raised a really interesting point about the kind of current things going on with the vaccine in the world, and obviously the coronavirus pandemic. So Jenny said, what do you think about the example of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine and the current media coverage? So Jenny sort of described this as an ethical company with a social purpose who are supplying the vaccine at cost, but then, they've received backlash in the media. So how would you say companies with a purpose can then handle potential negative media coverage in that instance? Or do you have any thoughts on that in general? John, do you want to start with that one?
Well, I'm happy to start because I actually genuinely don't know if it's an issue in America or not. But so forgive me, this may not be the entire, I'm not going to really go into great detail on this, but
Yeah.
the issue about AstraZeneca is wrapped up also in politics. So I have to say, being a British post-Brexit company invested in by the UK government with one of our leading universities of Oxford, and the issues with the European Union debate, with both the licensing across both US, Europe and Britain regulatory bodies, and then political statements by leaders of other nations causing doubt to manifest. It is such a complicated reputational aspect. There's no way that one can answer that question, I'm afraid, Jenny, on this question. All I'd say is that they have to be true to the values that are driving that. And of course, they will have responses to that. But I think that goes, you know, like they are being purposeful in my regard, but I'll call it there and hand over to Chip.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, John. It's a very complex one. And I think that the era we're in, where companies and CEOs are starting to weigh in on all kinds of social issues. We've seen the pharma industry sort of launch headlong into being involved in issues around the pandemic, whether sort of they wanted to or not. And I think what comes with that is sometimes potential backlash in the media. And I just don't know that there's much to be done about it. One thing I will say is that we did a large-scale study of how consumers view companies as either being purposeful or not purposeful. We did it pre-pandemic in 2019, and we just repeated it in January. And one of the things that you see is that in the eyes of the public, pharma in general has gone from the bottom of the list all the way to the top, including companies like AstraZeneca. So while they're getting a lot of backlash maybe from government and in the press and whatnot, I think people sort of see their actions as being quite purposeful, and it sort of turned things around for them.
That's a really good answer. Thank you. And I think just, staying true to that purpose is probably the most important thing in that sense then. Thank you. That was great from both of you. So the next question we have is from a different Jenny in the chat. And she said, what if senior leadership only want to relay your brand purpose on a superficial level and are reluctant and too risk averse to really commit to creating or advocating real change? Is there a bottom-up approach where other staff can help? Chip, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll be interested to hear what John has to say. I think we were talking before. I said I would love to write a book called How to Be a Purpose-Driven Company When Your Senior Management Doesn't Actually Believe in Anything. It's a joke. But I think the truth is you can't. If you do not have buy-in at the top, I mean, that's just a big signal that there's a problem. And it's a non-starter, at least in my view. I don't think you can just bubble things up from the top and hope that senior leadership gets involved. It's got to emanate in many ways from senior leadership. Anyway, my view. I know, John, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should write that book, actually. I think it'd probably be a bestseller.
Maybe there's a new collaboration for you both.
All the cynics in the world would go out and buy that, you know. So, yes, I agree. I agree with what you were saying, Chip, in that obviously leadership needs to be shown in this at a senior level to frankly, to commit time and resource and other things to make it happen. I think the wider aspect of this is not just about employees, it's about other stakeholders. You have investors now making demands on companies. You have customers making demands on companies. You have employees making demands on companies themselves. And interestingly, there's a fourth group which never would have been featured in previous analysis of business success or not, because in the past we would have said a business can be made or broken by those three groups. Customers, employees, investors. But actually now companies have been really challenged and almost brought down by the general public, the movements which Chip talks to, who aren't necessarily investors, aren't necessarily employees, are not necessarily even customers, but are demanding change around the environment campaign and things of that kind, which companies are now stepping up forward to do. But to go back to the question, therefore, there's a wider set of people, stakeholders affecting business leadership. I'd like to just give one example, though. If you take a very ethical, long-standing business like Marks and Spencer's in the United Kingdom, I'm sure many are familiar with the name. They have been on this track now for decades and decades and decades. If a CEO came into a business and was appointed, somehow got appointed, who didn't actually believe in ensuring sustainability and ethics, et cetera, and tried to change the culture in that business, they would be out, because the employees are the guardians. The employees have been working there for 10, 15, 20 years. They know how Marks and Spencer's culture operates. If a CEO arrives in from left-hand side and tries to change that, they won't survive. So I think there's a lot of variation here. But you've got to either ensure that senior leadership like that is fits into the culture, or senior leadership really should be taking on board what investors expect and what government expects and what society expects, because a measure of their good management is going to be a measure of how they either foster, create, or preserve the ethical purpose behind their business.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John, and a really good example. Thank you for that. That leads me, so talking of a very credible business like Marks and Spencer's, that leads me into another question that we have. So Akeem, apologies if I haven't pronounced that right, I think it's Akeem, has shared an example in the chat of Nike and the controversy around their federal tax payments in the US. And how this can kind of undermine the public's understanding of Nike's purpose and credibility. So what role would you say credibility plays in purpose? John, do you want to go for that?
So I'm not familiar with the tax situation.
Okay.
If it's to do with the payment of tax, I can give you an illustration as a response to that. Is that helpful? I don't know. I genuinely don't. I have another example, but I don't know that particular federal tax question, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, did you have any thoughts on that? And then maybe we can come back to your example, John, afterwards.
Yeah. Well, the notion of credibility, believability, and Nike does have a lot of issues around that. And referencing back to the research we did a couple of years ago, where we, from a individual consumer point of view, or regular people, what do they view a purposeful company to be? What makes it up? And I think what we learned is that purpose isn't one thing to people. It's kind of a story in their head. It's a narrative. And it has to do with things going on inside the company. What kind of products and services do they make? Do they operate sustainably? How do they treat their employees? What are they doing out in the communities? And also things like social activism. And I guess it could go all the way to doing the things like, are you a good corporate citizen? Are you paying your taxes? But the reason I bring all this up is that the companies that are viewed as most purposeful are doing all of those things. There's a complete story going on in the customer's mind about this company and what it believes in. And I think when you sort of land on one thing, like Nike does a lot of social activism, it can erode credibility and how purposeful the company is overall. Also, when people see a big outage, like failure to pay your taxes, even though the company is doing many, many other things right, that one thing can erode the entire story. So I think companies need to think about the entire story they're telling, and that one thing like that can sort of erode the whole thing and make the believability of the entire story fall apart.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point as well about it kind of being a different story to different people and meaning different things to different people. I can definitely see, how that would play out with lots of different examples. John, did you want to share the example that you had anyway on that subject?
Well, I mean, it's very quick. I mean, it might just be of interest, but a few years ago with my own agency, I was advising post the financial crisis a group board in the financial sector. I'm not going to name names for obvious reasons, who were opening a new business in a significant division, which in the words of the group chairman said, this is a dirty space. We're opening a new business and we want to have our business as the most ethical business in this space, in the financial sector. Great. And we were brought in to ensure that building out, as they brought people into the team, et cetera, was built out. They appointed an external CEO, very highly reputed, came in and started building the business before its launch. And I used to observe the board meetings and be asked to make comments and observations. And at one point, the new CEO turned around and said, actually, I've been able to shave off in the region of £7 million worth of expenditure on our marketing over the next 3 years. And the chairman and the group said, well, how's that going to work? And they said, well, we're going to create an offshore company that then channels our media buy through the offshore, And I'm sitting there, and at that time in the United Kingdom, there was a lot of controversy going on for film stars, pop stars, and people in the public domain having offshore tax avoidance measures.
Yeah.
And I could not believe this. And so when I was asked, I said, well, is this really going to be in fitting with what you're trying to build here around the ethical aspects of your purpose as a business? Now, interestingly, cut a long story short, that they decided that wasn't the appropriate way, even though the CEO kept saying, but it's legal, it's legal. The point was, it didn't matter that it was legal or not. It was how it would be perceived by people as whether or not it was the right thing. And this was critical about the building of the new brand. And within about 4 weeks, that CEO had been let go, because obviously their way of leading the business was not going to comply with what was trying to be created. So I think, it's just interesting stuff. It wasn't related to product. It wasn't related to service. It was related to how they thought they would lead the business. And they thought it was a great thing to save them money, but it wasn't going to be great for the brand. I think that's what we're seeing here now, right? Some of the things that I get involved with.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great example for highlighting that. And that actually links nicely with a comment we've had in the chat from Michael, who said that the former PepsiCo CEO calls the senior leadership team the frozen top regarding changes. And he's actually asked what techniques can you use to adjust and open their perspective if you feel like the frozen top sort of applies to your brand or business as well. John, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yes. I mean, the flippant thing would be get some de-icer in there and spray them. No, but I mean, seriously. So what we did for many years, I did this actually on behalf of the Prince of Wales, because I used to do the interaction with senior business leaders in the UK around getting their businesses to understand their impact in society, was that we actually used to take the most senior CEOs and their teams out into society to look at different aspects of the way in which their business affected people. So, for example, if they were in food retail, we take them to visit farms and dairies and things like that, which, of course, it sounds as if it would make sense, but actually a lot of supermarket CEOs and people of that kind had never been on farms, even though they're selling the product. So these C-suites are sitting around making decisions that are affecting by price points and things of that kind. Well, we got them up and got them out and got them to think differently about their role in the sector. And that, for almost 20 years, has been one of the most powerful tools in the United Kingdom for making change in behaviour at the most senior level. But it only happens, of course, because actually when the Prince of Wales writes a letter and I take it to a CEO of a business, it tends to have an effect. It's very hard if you don't have that ability to convene and say, well, you go and have a look at what is happening on these farms or in these schools or in this whatever, and come back and talk to me about it. It gets people focused around the issues as opposed to just the bottom line. That's what we did. So get people out of the boardroom, get them away from the comfort, go and show them something they don't normally look at, which is the impact of their business.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John. And Chip, do you have anything to add in terms of advice for sort of opening the perspective of C-suite or adjusting their current mindset?
Yeah, I agree with everything that John said. Something maybe even more basic than that I just observe over and over again is a lot of time these people in this, I think you call it the frozen C-suite or the kind of inchangeable top management, is that they don't talk to each other a ton. And they certainly don't have a sort of moderated conversation with the priorities coming out from the CEO as to this is what I think is important, and then having an open and honest discussion with everyone about it. You would think that that's the most basic thing, but often I don't think it happens around a lot of these issues. So I think sometimes just getting everyone together in a room for a purposeful conversation about these topics is probably the most important starting point.
Yeah,
I think that's an incredibly important point, actually, in that a lot of the work we've done has been actually being translators within the business. So actually, getting the head of marketing to sit down and talk to the head of sustainability, to sit down to the head of HR, to whatever, they just don't talk.
Right.
So we end up connecting internally before we even get to the point of getting outside. Critical point.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that comes back to the engaging people internally and externally, but also come back to our coffee analogy of top down, bottom up, and middle out as well. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you both. So just moving on to the next question that we have in the chat, is so moving kind of back to actually having your purpose and activating it. JM has said, if the purpose is too narrow, would you say this would have an impact on engagement? What I mean is, could you over segment your target market to the point where the customer won't see themselves fitting with that purpose? They said that they ask from a service provider standpoint with many eligibility criteria. Chip, do you want to go first with that? Have you got any thoughts on?
Just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly. So the question is, can you sort of have your purpose be focused too narrowly in a way that maybe just isn't relevant to a lot of people?
Exactly. Yeah. If it's too narrow, could you then actually negatively impact engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons that, I know I sound like a broken record, but finding the right way of framing your purpose is so important. And it starts, with some sort of a dissatisfaction out in the world that not only the company has, the brand has, but that all of its constituents share. So it can't just be a sliver of our audience is interested in X, Y, or has this X, Y, or Z need. It has to be something with some degree of universality across all of your stakeholders. Otherwise, it doesn't really work as a purpose for the whole company. So that is absolutely a danger, and very fundamental.
Definitely. Okay, thank you. John, do you have anything to add to that as well? Do you think that you can have a purpose that's too narrow and then sort of have the adverse effect?
Well, there are two different things here. So I absolutely agree with Chip. I mean, the first thing is a purpose of a business must be relevant to every audience that is relevant to that business. It cannot just be relevant to your customer and not to your employees or your investors, or it has to be relevant. So that means there's an element of broadness, even if the way in which the relevance is interpreted is clearly different by audience by audience. If the question is focused on customer particular audiences, and thereby becoming too narrow to therefore exclude certain obvious customers, then that, to my mind, is not necessarily the purpose, it's the activation of the purpose. It's, as Chip said, the framing, it's the communication, it's the, because that shouldn't happen. So that's the fault. If you get it right, I mean, obviously, well, that's a ridiculous statement. If you get it right, it's right, but it's not that the purpose is wrong. It's actually how you communicate the purpose to audiences that are critical to your business. That's the thing, in my view.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Makes sense. Thank you both. So the next question we have is from Gary in the chat, and he said, it feels like purpose can gain more traction than corporate social responsibility within a corporate culture. In some cases, CSR seems to have been subordinated to an employee or CSR officer, whereas purpose has to be part of the DNA of the entire employee network. Would you agree? John, you're nodding your head.
I'm desperate to answer this question. I'm sorry. Sorry, if that's okay, Chip. I'm Chip coming. The reason is that I have to say CSR failed. CSR is dead. Let's get rid of it. And the reason is because for 15 years of my life, I pushed CSR mainly for the Prince of Wales into the biggest boardrooms in the country and internationally. And we thought it was fine and we thought it was working until 2008, the financial crisis, where I witnessed the Prince of Wales at one of our big events handing out awards for great mentoring programs, great environmental programs, great employee diversity programs to the very companies who had behaved unethically, illegally in the financial crisis, because CSR programs and sustainability programs, however important they are, were always peripheral to the leadership and the incentivization in the business. So actually, if you were incentivized to get a big bonus for being, cruel and nasty and beat the opposition, it didn't matter that you had a community program or mentoring program. It was irrelevant to me because I was motivated in that way. The reason that the people that I've worked with over the last decade, the Paul Polmans of the world, their UK names, that global chair of KPMG, Sir Mike Rake, and other people, they recognized it then that we had failed in CSR. It needs to be taken off every business card. It needs to take off every report. We have got to put at the heart of business the reason why it exists is not a peripheral program, but it's an imperative that a business helps people and or the planet. And the ethics and the way in which that's manifested then comes into our space, which is the communication space, where we want to take the best businesses in the world to have the most positive impact in the world for the most people. Sorry, I've got on my high horse because I used to be the champion for CSR. CSR is dead. Purpose is the age we live in.
Not at all. That's a fantastic answer. I'm glad that question came up. Chip, do you agree with John? Do you have any thoughts on corporate social responsibility?
No, I couldn't agree more, and I don't think I could say it any better. I agree with everything John said. I think that in some ways social responsibility is kind of a passé way of thinking about things, and that we're kind of past the age of social responsibility and in the age of purpose. I think that's absolutely right.
It's gone beyond that now. Yeah, I think that's a great point made by both of you. Thank you. So we will be wrapping up very shortly. So if anyone does have any more questions, please do send them across. We've got a few more minutes for any left. Just whilst we wait for any other questions to come in, something that I wanted to ask you both was, obviously we've talked a lot about earlier we spoke about the social movements that have created a lot of change in the past year. I think, social media is a massive part of that and is, a very big part of the purposeful age that we're living in. How important do you feel that authenticity is on social media? And do you think social media opens up opportunities, or is it more of a hurdle to brands and businesses that are wanting to kind of activate their purpose? Do you have any thoughts on that, John or Chip? Either of you want to take that one
first? John, I don't know if you have thoughts off the top of your head. I mean, it's a broad question. I mean, I guess I view social media as a channel of, and I think the nice thing about it, obviously, it's a very interactive channel, and that often you get the feeling that you're seeing how a company believes and how it operates kind of in real time. So in that way, I think it can be very much more revealing about a company and how authentic it is to its beliefs than, say, advertising that gets made up somewhere and can be a little bit sanitized perhaps. So it's giving you more of a raw view, as I said, in real time of a company. So in that way, I do think it can be important to showing that you're kind of authentic and true to what you believe in, maybe more than some other channels. But I don't know, John, did you have a different thought on that one?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, so there's a basis here. Firstly, forget the channel for a moment. Whatever should be communicated should be true and authentic and realistic and should be verified by the behaviors of business. If we accept that that's fine, why would you want any less channels? I'm of a generation where frankly, I grew up with black and white televisions, and in the United Kingdom, 2 TV channels, one of which didn't have advertising on, okay? You didn't have a lot of channels to get your stuff out there. Now, companies that really have a great story to tell, who have ambassadors, not paid influencers, but are people that work in the business, who advocate the culture and behavior and everything else, have a multitude of channels to connect with their audiences in an authentic way, much more engaging, much more instant, much more constant, across a much broader sense than we ever had before. So I love it, even though I don't understand half of it. I love it because we want to talk about what we're good at as a business. And so I'm absolutely with that, as long as it's authentic. That's the critical thing.
Perfect. No, I think that's a really good point. Thank you both. So we have one final question in the chat from Janie. This is quite a big question, so it might be hard to condense down into a shorter answer, but we'll give it a go anyway. So the question is, what is the best way to utilize brand purpose to create a brand personality and positioning that stands out from competitors? So do you have, Chip, do you want to go ahead with that one? Have you got sort of a tip for that?
I do. It's kind of the whole point of our book. While the point of purpose isn't to have competitive advantage or stand out from the competition, it is an important byproduct of doing it the right way. So our whole concept of movement thinking as a way of framing your purpose is about doing just that. It's about, as I said, finding a cause in the world, a wrong that needs to be made right in the world, and taking a firm stand around it. And it's a sort of an alternative way of framing to classical brand positioning, which looks at, you know, your competitive set. You move your competitive set out into the world, into culture, thinking about the wrong that needs to be made right and the stand that you're going to take. Doing movement thinking correctly, sort of the SunTrust example that I gave, being a good simple one, did just that. By starting to stand for financial confidence and sort of away from financial stress, they really were talking a different story from any other bank that was out there. Now, they weren't doing it to be different from the competition, but by using movement thinking, they were able to accomplish that sort of as a byproduct.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. That's a really good example, I think. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything contradictory. I'd put it down to 3 things, though, really, which I think would be very much aligned, you know, with what Chip said. So the first thing is that once you've got your purpose aligned or whatever, and it has to meet a need. So, you know, what is wrong in the world? What is the vision of the change that you want to see? My number 1 principle is do it in partnership. So you can be a domino. You can find non-profit partners to do it, or even, certainly in my experience, if you take the market lead and do something that is justifiably right and proper, then other businesses in your sector will follow you. So you become the point of that movement. So do it in partnership. The second is do it long term. This isn't about the short term, oh, this is a campaign, let's do it for 3 months. This is about looking at changing the world through the great products and services that you do and the way in which you run your business over the long term. So commit and commit fully, I would say, for a longer term thinking than is often the case for an individual campaign. And, you know, I think the third thing is think big. You know, if you're going to commit resource, time, energy, get people mobilized, as Chip has described around this thing, then think of some really big, audacious goal that you want your business to be aligned and associated with. You know, is it about gender pay? Is it about gender parity? Is it about race? Is it about, it's got to be relevant to the business as we discussed earlier, but don't be mediocre. That's not the way you build big brands.
Perfect. Oh, what a line to end on. Don't be mediocre. I think that's a perfect point to finish on. Well, thank you both so much. That's yeah, really interesting. I think we could talk about it for hours, but unfortunately that is all we've got time for. Yeah, I'm sure everyone will agree it's really insightful. Can
I just show them?
You can.
We're here to plug the book. Okay. There's never an excuse. This one, mobilize the nation. The world, that one. Do it truthfully and honestly and authentically. Together. Bargain, Kogan Page, best publishers. There we go.
Thanks, John.
Fantastic. Thank you, John.
Totally did my job for me. That's perfect. Thank you so much. And if anyone attending today has missed any of our previous events, some of which you can see on the screen now, you can still watch the recordings on our website, koganpage.com, and you can also view the full list and sign up to any upcoming events as well. And just a final reminder, if John's wasn't good enough for you, that you can also save 25% on both Chip and John's books using the code OTP25 at koganpage.com as well. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording of today's event will be emailed around to everyone shortly as well. And that's all. So thank you all for coming today. Thank you again, Chip and John, for your time and for your brilliant answers to our questions. And I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much, everyone, and
wonderful.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.